Great. Thank you for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to kind of build on a talk that Dr. DiStefano and Dr. Cameron and I provided at the Eastern Athletic Trainers Association's annual meeting, and to kind of expand it out so we had more time to talk about each of the grant components. So we're here today to kind of help you kind of understand the grant application writing process. We won't necessarily talk about the ins and outs of the administration side of the grants, but we will talk about specifically today the specific aims. And over the course of the webinar series, we'll talk about other aspects of the grant, such as the innovation and approach. And we'll also discuss some of the funding agencies that are applicable within the United States. We'd love to be able to offer you this magic formula that could help tell you how to write a strong grant, but unfortunately there isn't one, but we're here to try and help. And I also want to highlight that for those of you who are ATOAC members, there are other members within the consortium that can also be available to you to help. And it's a good networking opportunity to connect with people who may be able to provide assistance. Regardless of what section of the grant we're looking at and where the money's potentially coming from, one of the most important things that we can highlight is to read carefully the grant guidelines before every submission. And even if you've submitted to that funding agency for that specific mechanism over and over again every year, you want to keep sure that you're reading those guidelines, because you want to be aware of any changes that may be occurring, especially as foundations continually adapt their guidelines to try and make it more efficient for both the writers as well as the reviewers. You also want to be cognizant of the fact that in some of the guidelines, sometimes the budget may be different than the typical funding mechanism, or the due dates may be slightly different. So be careful as you go through your guidelines to don't just skim over stuff. Make an outline of it and keep sure that you appreciate the unique aspects to each set of guidelines. Many of you probably have seen that the grant components, regardless of where you're going for funding, typically fall into categories like abstract, specific aims page, a significance background section. More and more, we're seeing innovation sections like what the NIH asked for. Some agencies will allow you to have a preliminary data section, or you may interweave that data into other sections, which we'll talk about in other future webinars. And then you also have an approach section, which describes the research design, the methodology, and the analysis. Today, we'll be really focused on the specific aims page, and we'll pay attention to the other aspects in future webinars. So the specific aims page should really be the first thing and the last thing you write. And it should be something that you spend a significant amount of time on throughout your grant writing process. And this is going to be something that you want to keep coming back to. And it really is going to take the majority of your time working on this one page, because this page should represent the essence of your entire grant. This is essentially your best marketing piece that you have. In this one page, you're going to try and make a sales pitch for the reviewers to buy into the fact that you're studying an important area and you've got the solution to do it, and you're the one to do it. So within your specific aims, you want to clearly state the problem to be studied and describe the gap that will be addressed and why it's important to address this. So essentially, you're providing a really tight, strong synopsis of the significance of your project. You'll also kind of express how you plan to solve that problem, which would be mirroring your approach section in some ways, as well as highlighting the most innovative aspects of your project, which obviously represents the innovation of the section of your grant. You can also highlight in your specific aims page how your specific project is going to align with the funding agency's research priorities, or even more specifically, how your project aligns with the research priorities outlined in your grant submission guidelines. You also want to clearly state your aims and your hypothesis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And you want to specify what aspects of the problems you will solve, and kind of what would be the take-home message from your project whether it was a successful project where you achieved all your aims, or if all your findings ended up being null, what would be the potential take home? And in that type of situation, it's a win-win. If you're hypothesize A, but B happens, you still want to be able to have a valuable outcome. One of the things to really appreciate when you're writing your grant, and specifically the specific aims, is the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So you need to be brutally honest with yourself, and perhaps the best way to do that is to get other people's opinions. So in our division, oftentimes what we do is we start writing our specific aims page sometimes 3 to 6 months in advance of the grant deadline. And in those earliest drafts, we send it to the other people in our department to get feedback from people who may be approaching it from different directions. And that initial feedback is sometimes we come with them saying, I'm not really sure how to set this up, or if I'm wording this right, or if there's this aim should be here rather than there. And then we also get general feedback from the people who are looking at it with a fresh set of eyes, who might say, I don't understand how you're getting from X, Y to Z. You say you're going to use these outcome measures, but it's never set up earlier. Or you might get feedback that says, these two specific aims are very similar. Perhaps you should consider combining them and adding another aim that looks at it this way. So it's important to get that feedback early on and throughout the grant writing process. And this will be an iterative process where you'll keep bouncing it back and forth, especially as you work on some of the other sections of your grants, as certain areas of your aims page tightens up. So keep sure that you're getting feedback from people, and that hopefully will involve getting feedback from the members of your study team, including your statistician, who could be really helpful in giving you feedback on the wording of your aims and hypotheses. But also, if you need to, getting feedback from people outside your study team who may have experience submitting grants to that funding mechanism or to that agency and has had success. And if you're lucky, they'll also be willing to share with you their examples of successful specific aims pages, because it's really helpful to see what's worked in the past. Oh, I like how they framed that section. I like how they formatted that idea or these aims. So really take advantage of the people around you. And if you feel like you don't have a strong core that has experience in a certain funding mechanism, then try to identify other people that you may know through your network that might have experience with that funding agency or that funding mechanism. And that's another way that the ATOAC member list can be helpful. Some more tips for the specific aims page. Remember, I kind of suggested this already. The specific aims page is really a marketing strategy for your grant. How do you sell the project and convince the reviewer that this is a good idea? Now, you might not win the grant on your specific aims page, but you can almost definitely lose them on the specific aims page. If a reviewer walks away from your specific aims page not sure what you're trying to do or thinking that this isn't really an important topic, then you're not going to probably win them over in the rest of the grant. So what you really want to do is have a strong specific aims page that convinces them that this is an important area to study. You're the ones that can do it, and this is how we do it. It should also be specific enough to apply the important variables and even the analytic approaches that you have. And you want this to be starting from the beginning of your approach down to the specific aims. There should be no curveballs that throws off the reviewer as they work their way through your aims page. By the time they read your specific aims and the hypotheses, it should almost be, the reviewer should almost be thinking, of course this is what you need to do. This is a great setup. This is what the only way to do it. And so you really want to narrow them down into, here's the problem, here's how we would do it, this is why these variables are the things to look at, and here we're going to look at those variables. You also want to clearly state the objective and why it's important. And a typical research proposal is going to have 2 to 4 well thought out aims. You can have some sub-aims. For example, if you had originally two aims that were somewhat similar, but you've merged them, you could consider having sub-aims there. In certain funding mechanisms, you may also have a methodological aim if you're planning to do something really innovative. But it is important for you to ensure that your specific aims are parallel to each other and not serial in nature. And what I mean by that is you want to keep sure that you do not have an aim that is contingent on the success of a prior aim. So you don't want to have aim 2 say, well, when we find this in aim A, we will do this. Because if you don't find that in aim A, you no longer have aim 2. So you want to keep sure that each aim is independent but complementary to each other so that the aims page as a whole, the collection of your aims, is greater than the sum of its parts, and that none of them are contingent on one another. And then we've already kind of stated this before, but don't wait to the end to write your specific aims. Write it throughout and keep revisiting it throughout the process, because you'll find that you'll be tweaking it up until the day of submission. The last edit that you make is probably going to be right before you submit it. So be aware of the fact that this aims page is going to take you a lot of time. And it makes sense and it's worth it because this is a really important part of your grant proposal. And as part of that, you need to be really brutally honest with yourself, and this can be another chance for you to get input on people, to be honest with yourself about what are the strengths and weaknesses of what you're proposing. And when you think about the limitations, you want to start to think about, should I incorporate this into my specific aims, or do I just add this into my alternative approach section of my grant? And you may want to have some flexibility within your specific aims to allow you to address some of the limitations that you're concerned about. But don't go in it saying, my study's all strong, because most grant mechanisms now are asking for you to have an alternative approach section where you acknowledge certain issues that may arise. And reviewers want to see that you've given the thought to, oh, okay, so they've acknowledged that this is a problem. Here's their solution. So you really want to be cognizant of that as you're writing your specific aims page. And oftentimes as I write my aims page and continue to revise it, I also will start adding stuff into my alternative approach section of, here's a minor point that I really don't want to bring up on my aims, but I want them to appreciate the fact that I acknowledge that that's a concern, and here's how we have thought about addressing it. Now what we'd like to do is kind of give you some examples from some specific aims pages that we have worked on in the past among the three presenters, Dr. DeStefano, Cameron, and I. We'll show you some of the strengths and weaknesses and how we may revise them. And then we'll also provide you with examples of some of the feedback that has been received on specific aims pages. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cameron.
Thanks, Jeff. And so I think this slide just provides an example of specific aims page that was submitted for review. And just at a quick glance, you can easily see that there are some limitations with this aims page. So obviously there are some grammar issues that are repeated. There are typos and errors. There are also some things that probably are a little bit more broader concerns when you look at these aims. So specifically, when you're looking at aim 2, the primary outcome that they're looking at is kicking velocity. And so, this aims page really doesn't make the connection of why kicking velocity may have clinical relevance or what's the significance of that. As a reviewer, that doesn't really seem that interesting or appealing. Maybe it is, but they haven't made the connection. They haven't linked the connection of why we should be looking at kicking velocity in this study and how that's clinically relevant. Another thing that really stands out on this aims page is aim 3. They're focused on test and retest reliability. This is an error that reviewers are going to notice. That's work that the review section is going to want you to do ahead of time. Maybe that's something you present in your preliminary data page or in your background section. But they want to know that you already have selected an outcome measure that is reliable and valid, and if it's not, then you've done the work to demonstrate that is, because they're not going to fund you to do that preliminary work. They want you to be ready to answer an important question. So obviously, as they say, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. So this aims page really doesn't, as Jeff said, market your project very well. Your reviewers likely already turned off. They're concerned that they're going to spend a lot of time reviewing this grant, and and you as a investigator couldn't take the time to even proofread this first section. So next slide, or next, Jeff, if you could advance it. Obviously you want to know your target audience, and you want to make sure that, as we talked about, that you highlight why this would be significant, why it would be of interest, how it aligns with the funding agency's priorities. And then you also, if you hit the next button, you want to make sure that you put your best foot forward. You really don't get 3 strikes in grant writing. And if you're only successful 1 out of 3 times, that's good in baseball, but not so good in grant writing in terms of getting things right when you're presenting that. Next slide. And then here are a couple other examples of aims. Again, as you look at these aims, just give you a few minutes to kind of digest what we're asking. And so one of the things that stands out in these aims as you look at them is really, it's not super focused. We don't have a focus question. We can't really tell what the design is going to be for this. It really tells the reviewer that maybe they haven't thought this through extremely well and in detail, because they're throwing a lot of different measurements out there, which tells me potentially as a reviewer that they don't really know which one's going to be important. So they're just trying to measure a bunch of stuff, and that hopefully something will stick, something will come out as significant. But we really haven't thought through maybe mechanistically why one of these would be important or which one is more important. Some of these things we may want to measure, but we wouldn't necessarily list them in our aims. Maybe we want to control for them as confounding variables, or maybe we want to account for them as effect modifying variables, either in design or in our analysis. But they don't need to be all listed in your aims. Next slide. So just like we talked about our aims, the hypotheses are very similar. Also, they want to have good hypotheses that catch the reviewer's eye. That's always a good way to get them interested in your project. Your hypotheses should be directly aligned with your specific aims. That's also sometimes a challenge that you see as a reviewer, is that someone will have a very interesting specific aim, but then the hypothesis really does not align with that aim. So you want to make sure that those line up. Your hypotheses should be supported with a clear rationale, like Jeff already talked about, as well as your aims. Your hypotheses also need to be clearly supported. They shouldn't really be a trivial statement, and they shouldn't be of low informative value, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. A well-formulated hypothesis, just like an aim, will imply experimental design as well as variables, and again, potentially analytical strategy. So if you write a good hypothesis, as a reviewer, I should kind of all of a sudden get that information and be able to have an idea about where you might be taking me throughout the rest of the application. You want to make sure that you keep the same wording for your aims and your hypotheses throughout the application. Again, as Jeff talked about, sometimes we'll draft them to begin with, spend a lot of time on them, and then as we work through writing the grant, halfway through, we'll realize, wait a minute, this might be a challenge that would be hard for me to overcome, so you'll modify your aims. If you do that in one section of the grant, that means you typically have to go through and do it in other sections of the grant, but you want to make sure that they're the same throughout, because that will confuse reviewers. So make sure you take the time to do that if you change your aims once you get started. And ideally, you have a pretty solid set of aims at the outset, so you don't have to do that very much. So the next slide, just again, some examples of hypotheses. So this first one, adult bone and growing bone react differently to mechanical loading. So this hypothesis really, it leaves a little to be desired. If you hit the next button, it's really fairly trivial. There's a lot of existing evidence to go along with this hypothesis. It doesn't really imply potentially what we're looking at in terms of design or analysis. Next, it's not really specific. It might be the ability to sense or respond to mechanical loading. So what exactly does react mean? Maybe we need to be clear in our wording on that. And then next, overall, this really is a fairly weak and uninformative hypothesis. Next slide. And next, so this is probably a little bit better revision of that hypothesis. Mechanical loading effects on bone formation and resorption differ in growing versus adult bone. So, as we look at that hypothesis, that revised hypothesis, I can fairly easily pull out some of those important things. So the independent variable obviously is growing bone versus adult bone. So that's really our primary independent variable. Mechanical loading could be a second mechanical or independent variable, but that's likely more our intervention. And then obviously our dependent variable is going to be bone formation and bone resorption. So I'm looking at that. So I'm really looking at a couple levels of an independent variable, and then maybe a couple of dependent variables that I'm looking at. So that really gives me a lot more information than that prior hypothesis. So again, if you hit the next button, this is really more focused. And then next provides higher informational content about how loading may affect certain aspects of bone growth, formation, and resorption. It implies a mechanism. And next, it also implies variables to be studied, as we talked about. And then next, it also points to an experimental design method. I kind of know what I should be seeing when I get to the design or the approach section. And then next, as Jeff talked about before, regardless of whether I find a difference or I don't find a difference between how mechanical loading affects resorption and basically bone turnover, then that really is a win-win either way, because that's going to provide good information going forward. Next slide. So are hypotheses always required? Not necessarily. So there are several different areas where you may not need a hypothesis. For example, bioengineering related grants where you're actually developing a project or a product, technology development where you're again developing some type of instrument or device. High-risk mechanisms such as the NIH R21 or the DoD Discovery Award may not require hypotheses. And then finally, if you're implementing a program or studying program implementation, you may not have hypotheses. But regardless, you're going to have well-defined objectives for any of these grants that fall into other areas that may not have research hypotheses. Next slide. So again, these are just some strengths that have actually been written by review panels when reviewing AIMS. So these are the types of things that you would want to see. Again, the objective of the study was clear. The purpose was directly related to things that are important to us as a review panel or as a foundation. The aims, along with hypotheses, are clearly stated and aligned with and support the objectives of the study. That's the type of feedback that you like to see when you're submitting your aims and you're getting feedback back from the reviewers. All right, next slide. And again, if we look at the aims and hypotheses, these are some weaknesses. Obviously, as Jeff talked about, you want to make sure up front to read the program announcement and the guidelines. If they say 1 page and you go 1.5 pages or even 1 page and a couple of lines, that's demonstrating that you can't really follow those directions. Your grant may be administratively removed. It may not even get to review. If it gets to review, the reviewers are definitely going to pick up on that because they have to read lots and lots of pages. So make sure, again, you follow the guidelines. Again, making sure that you articulate the significance. You want to make sure that people understand why this is important, how, if you answer this question, it's going to alter either clinical practice or it's going to alter patient outcomes. Those are the things you want to focus on. Why is it really important? Again, the rationale, you want to make sure you lay out your rationale and, failing to make that link between, why is this important and why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you studying the variables you're studying is a common mistake that's made when writing grants that often prevents people from getting those funded or scoring well enough to be considered for funding. Next slide. And I think that's kind of the overview of our presentation. So I think the key things are, the AIMS page is probably one of the most important things, probably the first thing that reviewers look at. It's going to really set up their mindset for the rest of the grant, as Jeff spoke about. So you want to make sure that you spend a lot of time, you really hammer it out. You make sure you have a really solid AIMS page before you kind of start moving through on everything else. If throughout you figure out that you need to make modifications to that, make sure that you change those in all areas. And again, you want to put your best foot forward, make sure that you don't have any mistakes, and that several people have looked at it and feel pretty confident about your aims page before you move forward. So I think that's all we have, Jeff, unless you have anything else. And then I think we can open it up to questions if we've received
Yeah,
any.
I would just echo one of the comments you made during your slides, which is keeping sure that your specific aims and your hypotheses align with each other and that you're consistent throughout the grant with that. Because one problem you sometimes see is the specific aims sets up a pretty compelling study for perhaps an association, but then the hypotheses are essentially more aligned with what you would have expected with a randomized clinical trial. And so the discordance there really then throws off the reviewer of what to expect from a design point of view. So it's really important to keep sure that the hypotheses and specific aims are consistent with one another. And that can be also a space where the biostatistician can be helpful for you too.
Yep, no, I think that's a great comment. And the one other thing, I know we're not to that section yet, but also your analysis too. Oftentimes, we see that somebody says either their aims or their hypotheses say they're going to do one thing, and then the analysis that they present in the research strategy section is really not aligned to answer those questions. So make sure those three things are aligned throughout your application. It's going to be really important to your success. So I agree with that as well.
Great. Well, I think now we can open up for some questions. So if you guys see the little chat button at the bottom of your screen, you can click on it and then type in any questions that you might have, and then I will ask them to our panelists. And then I can actually start you guys off with a question while maybe some of the other individuals are thinking or typing up some of their questions. But one of my questions to you guys is, how specific do you actually want to get in the aims and hypotheses? And what I mean by that is, how in depth do you want to use your technical language, or do you want to make your specific aims more broad in nature because you're speaking to maybe a different audience than what you're specifically targeting in your study?
Ken, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So I think like you said, a lot of times, particularly at NIH and within DoD, when you're talking about those study sections, you're going to have people who are experts in your content area, but you're also going to have a lot of other people that really aren't experts in that area. DoD includes a consumer reviewer. I think NIH, again, has people, they may have, for example, the bone hypothesis that I presented. They may have some people who are experts in bone, but they may have people who are experts in other areas that are there to review other grants. So I think you want to be specific enough, again, so that it doesn't really look like you're throwing the laundry list that you're going to examine. You want to make sure that you justify what you're looking at and it's fairly specific. Sometimes you may want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, but again, if you can kind of imply from your aims and your hypotheses, what the design is going to be, what the variables are, and how you might analyze that, then I think you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. I think you want to avoid a lot of lingo besides, unless it's important, because that may confuse people or it may lose people. But as specific as possible without using a lot of specific language that may only be understandable to a small segment of people. I would try and avoid that. Jeff, you have anything else that you would add?
Yeah, I think this was on one of the slides earlier, but it's important to know your audience. I think Ken has kind of alluded to that as well. So you want to know your audience, and then I will sometimes allow my specific aims to, I try to make them as specific as possible. But I also recognize that, sometimes I do need to look at a few variables that may represent a similar construct. And so to keep the specific aim, which is often bolded and only taking up like 2 lines on the specific aims page, I might refer to the construct, and then in the hypothesis, do kind of a parentheses IE, and then I list out the 2 or 3 variables that I think are really important there. But it is important for you too, as you're talking about how specific to be, to also ask yourself, what is the primary outcome measure, or what is your secondary outcome measure? Because you may get a lot of variables that are important to you, but what are going to be the ones that really make the compelling argument that you have resolved to use address that specific aim? And so oftentimes you can focus on that one primary outcome and then later on discuss, in addition to assessing this outcome, for example, this specific patient reported outcome, then in the approach you can say, but we're also going to have these other secondary measures that we think are important, but they won't be of that status of primary outcome.
Great. Abby asked a question, which is, how important is it to cite yourself to demonstrate that you were capable of collecting this type of data, or cite related literature to make your argument for the study that you're writing about more compelling?
Jen, do you want to take that first, or shall I?
I'll let you take a shot, and then I'll add in. We'll alternate back and forth like tennis.
Perfect. So what I often do is, very often in the beginning of my specific games page, when I'm setting up the broader area, I will be referencing seminal papers that may be establishing the significance of the topic area. But I pretty quick also will try and cite some of my own data. If it's published, I'll use those citations. But then as I get more and more specific to what I'm thinking about doing for my approach and the innovation of my aspect, I do try and bring in more of my own preliminary data to say, based on this preliminary data, we've been able to see that this relationship might be happening, and this is important. So we need to further follow it up. So a lot of times I will try in the middle of my specific games page to kind of hit on maybe one or two or three of the most important preliminary data that I have to offer. And it might only be captured in one or two sentences just to really hit home, like, we've thought this through and this is kind of what we have done. And so we've done our due diligence in trying to be confident that this is the right approach. And we can do it. Ken?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that Jeff said. I think you want to, if you've done work in that area, to demonstrate that you can do that, that your lab or your group has been able to isolate a cell line or to collect a certain type of data, then it's good to demonstrate that. Maybe not in the aims page, but in the background or in the preliminary data section. But I think that's the thing that they want to look for. If you're just kind of early on starting out, sometimes you may be able to get away with using other people's data to do that. But I think particularly at the NIH and DoD, they're going to want to see that you can do that and you can demonstrate that. So citing yourself or providing unpublished preliminary data can be very helpful in your background section or your significant section.
Great. So we have another question. When describing how your study findings can address gaps in the literature or how it could impact the profession, should specific short-term and long-term be provided, or should it just be the overall big picture?
So I guess I'm up first. I think if you can do both is good. I think if you can lay out, how, again, some grant mechanisms want to see a big change, and they may not want to see incremental changes, but some funding agencies like NIH, they want to see incremental changes that's going to, get to that long-term change. So I think both are good. I think, you don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you want to make sure that you, in a fairly short amount of time, can reasonably make those connections. A lot of people will throw a sentence or two out there that, sound great, but you don't really see how you're going to get from point A to point B to point C. So I think trying to, particularly more in the grant section, lay that out is important. Maybe not as much in the aims, or maybe you just highlight it in the aims and then you really kind of get to the details throughout the application. But I think it's important, and I think it really kind of depends on, again, your audience, as we talked about. But I think it's important to do that, and you can do that either way once you look at who you're applying to and what's of importance to them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important to look at your funding mechanism and to be honest with yourself about what is kind of the potential clinical outcomes. You don't want to put yourself out there and say, I think that this will be used for this in the clinical setting, and then have a reviewer just say, well, that's just not feasible. You know, like people can't spend $500 to have that in the clinic, or they can't pay do this if it's that challenging to actually implement the method. So you want to be realistic in what your clinical approach outcomes could be, but it is helpful to have short and long term, but it can also depend on the funding mechanism that you're going for. If you're going for more of an exploratory discovery mechanism, it might be okay that your big next step is to develop a research tool that can be then used in future grant proposals or clinical trials. If you're doing a more established line of funding, such as an R01 research project, the expectation might be that there's at least some potential benefit at the end of the study for the findings. It doesn't necessarily need to be the biggest thing in the world, but that there is some potential benefit clinically, or at least that'll help sell the project a little bit more. But that's kind of my take on it.
Great. We just had just a side question, which is, will the slides be posted after the webinar? One thing is that there will be a recording of the webinar posted. Jeff, I wasn't sure if you guys would be posting the slides or not, but the webinar will definitely be posted.
I think at the end of the webinar series, we'll be posting a copy of the slides.
Great, great. Okay. I also have, please, I encourage you guys to ask any questions that you guys may have, just type them in the chat. But I also have a question that was emailed to me for an individual who was unable to make it. And this was from a grad student, and they were asking about what kind of opportunities you guys know of for grad students for grants.
So the question, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I think we had a similar question, but from a funding mechanism point of view, I think it's definitely, it depends on where you're looking for and what your area of research is. But within athletic training, for example, the NATA Foundation does have awards for doctoral students and master students. And a lot of foundations have awards for students. So it's worth looking at the different foundational level. Certain NIH agencies, I think, also offer those, or they will do it through a program grant or a training grant that your institution might have. So there may be internal mechanisms. If the question's more related to getting experience with grant writing, I'm not sure if there's a specific program out there just for students, but there's often workshops that are held in conjunction with other annual meetings, whether it's by young professional committees or by the certain foundations. And then there's always trying to write one with one of your mentors that would be advantageous. Ken?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, there are a lot of opportunities. Foundation grants are a good way to get started. EATA, has a granting mechanism for people who are in District 1 or District 2 for NATA, and I think a lot of the regional athletic trainer societies and districts have those. So, that would be a good place to look. I think if you're asking about, where do you get experience, I think there are a lot of good programs out there. Maybe not for doctoral students, but there's the NATA. The foundation has the mentoring program. Again, hopefully link you up with somebody who has interests that are similar to yours that can help you in that area. Also, folks in your department, hopefully you can find people that can help with that. Again, once you get done, there are grant writing workshops like Orthopedic Research Society, ORS, and OREF. They have some that, again, probably apply that you can go to for a weekend or a couple of days. The U.S. Bone and Joint Initiative has a program that's really a year-long program, but again, they're probably looking for people who are assistant professor level and are just starting their career. But I think some of those others can be applicable to doctoral students as well.
Sounds like some great resources. Thank you. So we have another question, and you guys have kind of mentioned a lot throughout your presentation about knowing your audience. And so when we're applying to different foundational mechanisms, say NATA or some of our more regional ones, we realize that we'll probably be catering our specific aims in our grant to athletic trainers. But when you're applying to larger funding agencies like the NIH or DoD grants, how often do you know your audience, and how do you really cater to some of those larger funding agencies in that capacity?
So I think, again, I think this is a challenge, I think, for some of our folks sometimes. You know, we get good at writing for other athletic trainers, but we don't really think about the broader implications of some of our research. So NIH and DoD, NIH specifically is going to want to see how this really benefits a broader population typically. So what is the impact? What are you really looking at? Obviously in osteoarthritis, if we can show that people are getting osteoarthritis much earlier, they're going to live a larger portion of their life with the challenges that are associated with osteoarthritis. We're going to want to make that connection. They're more concerned, again, about how the work that we do can affect a broader swath of people. And I think it could inform, osteoarthritis across the spectrum potentially. Again, depending on the specific project, but those are the things you want to sell to NIH. To DoD, you want to focus on, again, what's important to them. What's important to them is keeping people who are in the service so that they're able to do their job. They're able to keep doing their job after they spend a lot of time and energy in training those people. So again, focusing on what's important to that audience is going to be really important. But I think if we talk about athletes and a lot of times we like to use that terminology, and it works well with athletic trainers, but it may not play well with NIH study section or portions of DoD unless you really make that connection why a young athletic population may be important to study and how that relates to those organizations' outcomes of interest.
I think especially for the national organization, for like the DoD and the NIH, it's important to look at the specific, within NIH, the specific institute and what their mission and vision is, as well as what their research priorities are. That can help guide you to tailor your specific aims page and say, we are responding to this research priority within NIAMS. Alternatively, some program announcements or RFAs will have a specific list of, hey, these are the areas we're actually interested in. And so you could say, we're responding to this one. And one of the things when I see stuff like that, where the RFA or the program announcements list specific areas of interest, I'll quote them sometimes, or I'll try and throw back their wordings in different areas of my grant so that they understand that, we're being very responsive to that program announcement. The other thing that you can do to get to know your audience a little bit is when you're considering submitting to the NIH, you can look at some of the where the similar grants have been funded by using NIH Reporter, and you can get a sense for which study sections you may want to go through. And the list of prior memberships of the study sections are available online, so that'll give you a little bit of a sense of who in the past has sat on these study sections. And so you might be like, oh, that specific study section has a lot of epidemiologists on it, or, oh, there's a lot of rheumatologists on that one, or a lot of orthopedics on that one. So that can help you tailor your grant a little bit. But I think a big part of it is looking at the research priorities of the funding agency and the program announcement.
Yeah, and as Jeff said, I think you can obviously see who sits on the study section, which can sometimes be helpful. Obviously, if you're writing in a certain area, you may want to make sure to cite some of those people's work if it's relevant. Again, it sounds silly, but if you're writing in their area and you're not citing their work, it may not look favorably on you. It shouldn't, but that's how it works sometimes. I think the other thing is, within NIH at least, you can request which study section you want your proposal to go to. So you have the ability to do that. You can work with the program manager and potentially say, well, this is probably a better fit for this study section than it is for this other study section. So you have the ability to do that. I think with NIH and DoD, you don't really have that opportunity.
And Ken, just to clarify, with the DoD, there's a consumer reviewer as well, right?
Yeah, so a consumer reviewer with most of the CDMRP programs. So, for example, if it's osteoarthritis, they may have somebody who, suffers from osteoarthritis, or they help a family member that suffers from osteoarthritis. Typically, you see this in your you know, in the peer-reviewed orthopedic, you may have people with amputations, or you may have people with spinal cord injury, or some of these things, or family members that care for somebody who's had a traumatic brain injury. Those people sit on the panel. They don't review the scientific aspect of things, but they review certain aspects of the grant, like relevance. You know, why is it important? You know, whether or not this answers an important question to people who are actually, you know, suffering or dealing with somebody who's experiencing the disease or the condition.
Great. So in regards to resources, and I think that you guys can talk about this potentially in two different capacities. They're kind of very different from each other, but one is, what are some resources that you guys utilize to search for different grants? And the other question is, do you guys have any resources that you would recommend for reading on improving grant writing in general?
So this is Ken. I don't know if there are any specific resources on grant writing. There may be. I think, again, some of those workshops that we talked about are good resources. I honestly, like Jeff said earlier, I think one of the best resources is finding grants that have been successful in the past and reading through those and looking at how those are set up, how they're laid out. You know, that's one of the most valuable things I think that I've done is being able to see what success looks like, and you know, you can take things from different grants that you may apply or combined to kind of develop your own style. I think you know, in terms of the overall grant, you don't want to pack. You know, you may have a 10-page limit, but you don't want to completely pack that grant. You may want to include some pictures and some figures that are important, that communicate a lot of information. You want to leave white space so that, you know, you think about how your reviewers are going to receive that. If it looks like you've crammed as much as you possibly can into the grant, it's hard on the eyes when you've got to read hundreds and hundreds of pages of grants. So think about you know, how your grant is going to appear to your reviewers. And you know, some of them, you see them and they're aesthetically pleasing, and you say, hey, I want to read this grant because it's got good aims. You know, those are two wins right out of the box. And I think you know, I think if you cram a bunch of stuff, you don't have any figures because, you know, you feel that you've got to use all the space to communicate what you're trying to do. That can be a challenge. So I think those are some things that I would recommend. Also, you know, try and work with people who have done this before. That can help. And then again, some of those 2-day workshops can be helpful. And your institution may have opportunities to help young investigators or even graduate students to learn a little bit about grant writing too.
Yeah, my personal opinion is it's really helped. One of the best experiences I've had is writing grants and just getting some experience under my belt and getting feedback from a lot of people, and also seeing what other people do in their grants. I can tell you that I still adapt how I present my grants visually, pretty much every submission based on what I see for myself, what I see as a reviewer, and what I see from peers doing. So it's a constantly evolving process, and it's one that I just gain experience every time I see somebody else's grant. And every time I write a grant, I find new ways to do it. So I think a lot of it is trying to do it and getting experience and asking mentors to have opportunities to help with their grant writing. And also, I mean, taking advantage of the fact that a lot of foundations like the NATA Foundation have awards that are eligible to graduate students and doctoral students, or taking advantage of local grant funding mechanisms like the EATA or other districts around the country. For searching for grants, a lot of it is I kind of know which funding agencies have funded in the past. So I kind of keep on my calendar a reminder of when things tend to come out. The NIH also has an email that they send out on a weekly basis that kind of updates you on the program announcements throughout the NIH, which can be really helpful to see when they release new notices, when they release new RFAs, and when they release new program announcements. The other thing you can do sometimes is take advantage of Your research administrators at your university or college, they might be able to tell you of funding mechanisms or funding sources within your area of interest, and talking to peers about where they've been successful in the past. And sometimes it's worth considering non-traditional sources of revenue as well, not just foundations and large funding agencies like the DoD or NIH, but also looking towards some of the foundations that may be run by companies. So some pharmaceutical companies, for example, will offer grant opportunities periodically. So it's worth also looking out for those and asking research administrators if they have any ideas. And also on a formatting note, I mean, when we get into the specific aims and the approach section of our grant, we'll talk a lot more about kind of formatting those sections to make them appealing to the reviewer. So as Ken said, the reviewer doesn't open up the grant and just kind of sigh and feel like they're defeated already just because it's 12 pages of all text with nothing breaking it up. So we will talk about that in future webinars.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the one other thing that Jeff mentioned that he didn't really, I guess, get into detail on, I guess, was the, if you have an opportunity to review grants, I would definitely recommend taking it. If you have the opportunity to sit on a review section, if you have the opportunity to review for NATA or EATA or any of these organizations, again, you get to see a lot of different approaches. I've done that. It's been very helpful through DoD and, being able to see what people do, when you really get a really good grant to say, okay, how did they set this up? And that can be very helpful as well. So you also get to see the really poor examples by reviewing grants and say, okay, I definitely don't want to do that. I want to make sure that I do a better job on mine. So I think those are good. Also through DoD, like Jeff said, you can sign up for email notifications anytime an announcement is made, or if there's a pending announcement that's coming up, they can give you advanced notification. So most of those granting agencies, you can sign up for email notification for, when those things are coming online.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions and we're running out of time, but part 2 will be coming soon. And thank you, Dr. Dryden and Dr. Cameron, for sharing your experience and this presentation with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, thanks for the opportunity and hope everybody has a great week.